"You don't belong here," the officer said, his voice cutting through the quiet afternoon like a blade that had been sharpened long before this moment ever began. And just like that, everything changed on a porch that had always meant safety, ownership, and peace. The sunlight stretched across the wooden boards in warm golden lines, the kind that usually made a house feel like home, but now it only illuminated tension hanging heavy in the air as Marcus Johnson stood there, one hand loosely holding a ceramic coffee mug, the other resting at his side, calm, steady, unshaken in a way that didn't match the situation unfolding in front of him. Across the short walkway, Officer Daniel Reeves stepped forward with purpose, his boots firm against the concrete, his posture rigid with authority, the badge on his chest catching the light like it was meant to remind everyone exactly who held the power here. A patrol car idled at the curb, engine humming softly, radio whispering static, a quiet backdrop to something that was quickly spiraling into anything but routine. Marcus didn't move at first, not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because he understood it too well, the kind of understanding that comes from experience, from knowing how quickly assumptions can turn into actions and actions into consequences. The neighborhood itself seemed to hold its breath, curtains shifting just slightly behind windows, a distant dog barking once before falling silent, as if even the world around them sensed that this moment was about to matter. Reeves closed the distance, his eyes locked onto Marcus with a certainty that didn't ask questions, only delivered conclusions, and when he spoke again, it wasn't a conversation, it was a command. "Step forward and keep your hands where I can see them." The words landed hard, not because of their volume, but because of the meaning behind them, the presumption already built in, the decision already made. Marcus slowly set his coffee down on the porch railing, careful, deliberate, every movement controlled, his gaze steady as it met the officer's, not defiant, not submissive, just present, as if he was watching something inevitable play out in real time. "Officer," he said calmly, his voice even, measured, "this is my home." It should have been enough. It should have changed something. But it didn't. Reeves barely reacted, his jaw tightening slightly, his hand hovering near his belt, authority turning into action without hesitation. "We've had a report," he replied, each word clipped, final, "and I'm not going to ask again." Somewhere down the block, a car slowed, the driver glancing over, sensing the shift in the air, the invisible line that had just been crossed. Marcus exhaled quietly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when a moment stops being about facts and starts being about perception. "You're making a mistake," he said, softer now, but somehow heavier, like a warning wrapped in restraint. Reeves let out a short, humorless breath, the kind that dismissed rather than considered. "Yeah," he muttered, stepping closer. "We'll see about that." And just like that, the space between them disappeared, replaced by tension you could almost feel pressing against your chest, thick, unspoken, unavoidable. The porch that had once been nothing more than a place to drink coffee and watch the day pass by had become something else entirely, something colder, something sharper, something that neither man would walk away from unchanged, though only one of them understood just how far this moment was about to go. The air did not move after those words. It just sat there, heavy and waiting, like something unseen had already decided how this would end, and the only thing left was for it to unfold in its own time. While Marcus Johnson stood on the worn wooden boards of his porch, his shoulders relaxed but his presence grounded, as if he was rooted to that spot in a way that went deeper than ownership, deeper than paperwork, something quiet and unshakable that Officer Daniel Reeves could not quite understand but refused to acknowledge, because in his mind, the situation had already been defined, already categorized, already closed. Reeves shifted his stance slightly, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe, not looking for answers, but confirming assumptions, the kind that form long before two people ever meet. And as his radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, he reached for it without breaking eye contact, pressing the button with a sharp motion that matched the tension in his voice. "Dispatch, I have a possible suspect at the location," he said, each word measured but edged with certainty, as if the conclusion had been reached long before the call was made. The word suspect seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, stretching the moment, twisting it into something heavier than reality, and Marcus heard it clearly, felt it settle in the space between them, not as a label, but as a decision. He glanced briefly toward the street, noticing the second patrol car, now turning the corner slowly, its movement deliberate, like it had been called not for clarity, but for reinforcement. The sound of tires rolling over asphalt grew louder, then softer, then stopped, adding another layer to the scene that was already becoming something far bigger than it should have been. Marcus brought his attention back to Reeves, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, his voice calm when he spoke again. "You are escalating this without reason," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact, the kind that usually opens a door for reconsideration. But here, it only seemed to harden the line that had already been drawn. Reeves tilted his head slightly, a faint, almost amused exhale leaving his mouth, as if the calmness in Marcus only confirmed something in his mind rather than challenged it. "You can explain it downtown," he replied, his tone final, already moving past the possibility of resolution. Somewhere behind them, a screen door creaked open just an inch, then stopped, someone watching, not speaking, not intervening, just witnessing, and that silence added weight to everything, because it meant this moment was no longer private, no longer contained. It had become something public, something recorded not just by phones but by memory. Marcus lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, but in thought, as if calculating something unseen, something beyond the immediate tension, and when he looked back up, there was something different there, not louder, not sharper, just deeper, like a shift had taken place beneath the surface. "Officer," he said quietly, "you still have time to step back." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that did not match their volume, a warning that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Reeves did not respond right away, but his expression tightened, something flickering behind his eyes for just a fraction of a second, uncertainty brushing against certainty before being pushed aside. He stepped forward again, closing the last bit of distance, the authority in his posture returning stronger, louder, more certain than before, as if he needed to prove it not just to Marcus, but to himself. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice firm, leaving no space for negotiation. And for a moment, just a moment, everything seemed to pause, the street, the houses, the quiet watching eyes, all of it suspended in a silence that felt almost unnatural, like the world itself was waiting to see what Marcus Johnson would do next, because whatever came after this, it would not be something easily undone. For a brief second, it looked like Marcus Johnson might refuse, not out of defiance, but because something in the moment felt fundamentally wrong, like a line had been crossed that could not simply be stepped back over. Yet instead of resisting, he slowly turned around, his movements controlled and deliberate, the kind of calm that did not come from submission but from understanding something deeper than the situation itself. And as he faced away from Officer Daniel Reeves, the late afternoon sun stretched his shadow across the porch, long and steady, unmoving even as everything else around him seemed to tighten with anticipation. Reeves stepped in closer, the sound of his boots against the wood sharper now, more pronounced, as if each step was meant to reinforce the authority he believed he held. And for a moment, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, like something in Marcus's stillness did not quite fit the picture he had already decided on. But that hesitation passed quickly, replaced by routine, by procedure, by the need to follow through on a decision already made. The faint metallic click that followed was small, almost insignificant in volume, yet it echoed far louder in the space between them, marking a shift that could not be undone, and Marcus's hands remained steady, his posture unchanged, his silence louder than any argument he could have made. Down the street, the second officer stepped out of the newly arrived patrol car, glancing between Reeves and Marcus, his expression uncertain, as if trying to piece together a situation that did not quite add up, but choosing not to question it. Not here, not now. A phone lifted from behind a half-drawn curtain, another from across the sidewalk, quiet observers capturing fragments of a moment that was quickly becoming something none of them fully understood. Marcus tilted his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry without raising it, calm and clear, directed not only at Reeves, but at the weight of everything unfolding around them. "This is not going to end the way you think it is," he said, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a certainty, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person does not. Reeves let out a short breath through his nose, tightening his grip just slightly, as if the words irritated him more than concerned him, and he stepped back, creating a small distance, looking Marcus over again, this time with a trace of something different, not doubt exactly, but curiosity mixed with resistance, as if part of him recognized the disconnect but refused to follow it. "Everybody says that," Reeves replied, his voice edged with impatience, though it lacked the confidence it had carried before, just enough to suggest that something beneath the surface had shifted, even if he would never admit it. Marcus said nothing after that, and that silence settled over the porch like a weight, heavier than any argument, heavier than any raised voice, because it left space for reality to catch up, for something unseen to move closer. The faint hum of an engine approached from farther down the block, different from the patrol cars, smoother, quieter, deliberate in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and though no one spoke, several heads turned almost at the same time, drawn by something they could not yet identify. Reeves did not notice at first, his focus still locked on Marcus, still anchored in the moment he believed he controlled, but the second officer did, his posture shifting slightly as his eyes tracked the approaching vehicle, something unreadable passing across his face before he looked back at Reeves, then at Marcus, then back again, as if silently asking a question he was not ready to voice. The vehicle slowed as it neared the house, its presence subtle but undeniable, and in that quiet, suspended moment, Marcus Johnson finally allowed himself the smallest shift in expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, just a subtle release, like a clock that had been ticking in the background had just reached the exact second it was meant to, and whatever came next was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. The vehicle came to a smooth, controlled stop just a few feet from the curb, its dark exterior reflecting the fading sunlight in long, quiet streaks, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the entire street had been placed on pause, waiting for something unseen to step forward and reveal itself, while Marcus Johnson remained exactly where he was, his hands secured, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady ahead, as if he had already accepted that this moment was no longer about him proving anything, but about something else entirely arriving on its own terms. Officer Daniel Reeves finally turned his head, his attention pulled by the presence of the unfamiliar SUV, his eyes narrowing slightly as the engine went silent, a subtle shift passing across his expression, not yet concern, but no longer complete certainty either, because this was not part of the sequence he had already mapped out in his mind. The second officer took a small step closer, his stance no longer as rigid, his focus now divided between Reeves and the vehicle, as if something about the situation had begun to unravel just enough for doubt to slip through the cracks. The driver's side door opened first, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that carried more weight than any sudden movement ever could, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his posture straight, his presence calm, the kind of calm that did not come from authority being claimed, but from authority already established long before he arrived. Another door opened on the opposite side, then another, and within seconds, 3 figures stood beside the vehicle, all dressed similarly, all composed, all moving with a deliberate coordination that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Reeves shifted his weight, his grip loosening just slightly, his attention now fully drawn to the scene unfolding in front of him, and for the first time since he stepped onto that porch, there was a flicker of hesitation in the way he held himself, a subtle break in the rhythm of control he had maintained until now. The man who had stepped out first began walking toward the house, his pace unhurried, each step measured, his eyes scanning the scene once before settling on Marcus, then on Reeves, and finally on the space between them, where everything had already been decided, just not in the way Reeves had expected. Marcus did not turn, did not call out, did not react in any visible way, and yet something in the air shifted the closer the man approached, like a pressure building without sound, without force, just presence. Reeves straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his stance, his voice returning, though it carried less certainty than before. "This is an active situation," he called out, his tone firm but edged with something that had not been there moments ago. "You will need to step back." The man in the suit did not stop immediately, but he did slow, his gaze meeting Reeves with a calm that did not challenge, but did not yield either. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying easily across the short distance without the need to rise. "Officer," he said, simply, and that single word held more weight than the commands that had filled the porch just moments before. The second officer glanced at Reeves, then back at the approaching figures, his uncertainty now visible, no longer hidden behind silence, as if he was beginning to understand that something larger than the moment had just arrived. Reeves hesitated, just long enough for the shift to become undeniable, his authority no longer the only force in the space, no longer unquestioned. And as the suited man reached the edge of the walkway, he stopped, his eyes moving once more to Marcus, taking in the stillness, the restraint, the quiet certainty that had never wavered. And in that pause, that single suspended second, the balance of the entire situation began to tilt, not through force, not through volume, but through the quiet arrival of something Reeves had never considered, something that did not need permission to take control. The silence stretched just a little longer than it should have, long enough for the weight of uncertainty to settle into the space where certainty once stood, and Officer Daniel Reeves felt it, even if he refused to fully acknowledge it, because something about the way the suited man held himself, the way the other two remained just behind him without speaking, without reacting, began to shift the entire atmosphere of the scene from something routine into something far more deliberate. The man stepped forward one final pace, stopping just short of the porch steps, his eyes calm, observant, taking in every detail without haste, as if he was not arriving to understand the situation, but to confirm what he already knew. Reeves cleared his throat slightly, adjusting his stance again, his voice returning with an edge that tried to reclaim control. "I said this is an active situation," he repeated, though this time the words lacked the sharp confidence they once carried. "You need to identify yourselves." The man in the suit did not respond immediately, and that pause was not hesitation, it was intention, a quiet moment that forced Reeves to sit in the uncertainty he had created. And when the man finally reached into the inside of his jacket, the movement was slow, deliberate, visible enough to remove any doubt about what was coming next. A small leather case appeared in his hand, and with a practiced motion, he opened it just enough for the badge inside to catch the light, not flashing it aggressively, not forcing it forward, just allowing it to be seen. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice steady, measured, leaving no room for interpretation, no room for dismissal. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because they landed exactly where they were meant to, cutting clean through the tension like something precise and undeniable. The second officer shifted immediately, his posture changing in a way that revealed recognition before he even spoke, his eyes widening just slightly as he looked from the badge to Marcus, then back again, the pieces beginning to fall into place in a way that made the situation suddenly feel very different. Reeves, however, did not move right away, his gaze fixed on the badge, his expression tightening, as if his mind was working to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had already decided. And for the first time since he stepped onto that porch, the control he believed he had began to slip, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his breath caught just slightly before he forced it steady again. The suited man closed the badge calmly, returning it to his jacket as if the action itself was nothing more than a formality, something already understood before it was ever shown. And then his attention shifted fully to Marcus, his tone softening just a fraction, though it never lost its authority. "Agent Johnson," he said, the name spoken clearly, deliberately, and that single acknowledgement changed everything, because it confirmed what had only been hinted at until now, turning uncertainty into fact, turning tension into consequence. Marcus finally turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the man's gaze, and for the first time since this began, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, like a plan moving exactly as it was meant to. The neighborhood remained silent, but the silence was no longer the same. It was no longer filled with confusion or assumption. It was filled with realization, the kind that spreads quietly, person to person, without a single word needing to be spoken. Reeves swallowed once, his grip loosening without him fully realizing it, his eyes flicking briefly toward Marcus, then back to the suited man. And in that small, almost invisible moment, the balance of power that had once seemed so certain had completely shifted, leaving him standing in a situation he no longer controlled, and perhaps never truly did. For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence carried more weight than any command that had been given before, because now the truth was no longer something hidden beneath the surface, it was standing in plain sight, and Officer Daniel Reeves could feel it pressing against him from every direction, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a quiet certainty that was impossible to ignore. His eyes moved from the suited man back to Marcus Johnson, lingering there just a fraction longer than before, as if searching for something he had missed, something that might still justify the path he had already taken. But there was nothing there except the same calm presence that had been there from the beginning, unchanged, steady, and now undeniably grounded in authority he had failed to recognize. The second officer shifted again, this time stepping slightly back, creating a subtle distance that had not existed before, his body language no longer aligned with Reeves, but not yet fully aligned with the agents either, caught somewhere in between as reality continued to settle in. The man from the Federal Bureau of Investigation took one step closer to the porch, his gaze steady, his tone firm but controlled when he spoke again. "Officer, you are detaining a federal agent on his own property without cause," he said, each word precise, not raised, not forced, just placed exactly where it needed to be, leaving no room for interpretation, no room for argument built on assumption. Reeves opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came immediately, because whatever he had prepared to say before no longer applied to the situation in front of him, and for the first time, the structure he had relied on began to collapse under the weight of something far more real. He cleared his throat, his voice returning, but quieter now, less certain. "We received a call," he said, almost defensively, as if the explanation itself might restore the balance he had lost. "I was following protocol." The agent did not react emotionally, did not challenge the statement with force, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a firmness that replaced patience. "Protocol requires verification," he replied, his eyes never leaving Reeves, "not assumption." The word assumption lingered, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it did not accuse, it revealed, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that this situation had never been about a report, or a call, or even procedure. It had been about something deeper, something unspoken that had now been brought into the light without needing to be named. Marcus remained still, his hands still restrained, but there was no tension in him, no urgency, only a quiet awareness that everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, measured, directed not just at Reeves, but at the moment itself. "You had every chance to step back," he said, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a simple clarity that carried more impact than either of those things ever could. Reeves swallowed, his grip loosening further, his hand hovering uncertainly for a second before he finally stepped forward, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each action had to be reconsidered before it was made. The faint metallic sound that followed was softer this time, almost reluctant, and when Marcus's hands were finally free, he did not move immediately, did not rush, did not react in any visible way. He simply lowered his arms calmly, as if the restraint had never truly defined him in the first place. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the shift, but his attention remained on Reeves, because this moment was no longer just about release. It was about consequence, about understanding, about what came after the illusion of control had been stripped away. And standing there on that same porch, under the same fading light, Officer Daniel Reeves was no longer the one giving orders. He was the one facing them, whether he was ready to accept that or not. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved slowly, almost quietly, like a tide turning beneath the surface, but everyone standing there could feel it, the unmistakable change in who held the weight of the moment. And as Marcus Johnson adjusted his stance slightly, rolling his shoulders back now that his hands were free, there was no urgency in him, no visible reaction to what had just happened, only a calm presence that somehow carried more authority than anything said before, while Officer Daniel Reeves remained still for a second longer than necessary, his hands now empty, his posture no longer anchored in command, but caught in the space left behind when control slips away. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agent stepped forward onto the first step of the porch, closing the distance just enough to make it clear that this was no longer a situation being observed from the outside. It was one being addressed directly, and his voice, when he spoke again, was not louder, but it carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Officer Reeves," he said, using the name with deliberate precision, "we are going to need you to explain exactly what led to this decision." The question was simple on the surface, but the weight behind it was anything but, because it was no longer about what had happened, it was about why it had happened, and that difference was where everything began to unravel. Reeves blinked once, his eyes briefly shifting toward the second officer, as if looking for something to anchor himself to. But there was nothing there, no support, no reinforcement, just a quiet distance that had grown between them without a single word being spoken. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising as if preparing to rebuild the authority he had lost. But when he spoke, the words came out measured, cautious, carefully chosen in a way they had not been before. "We received a report of suspicious activity," he said, his tone controlled, though it carried a faint strain beneath the surface. "I responded based on that information." The agent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his attention focused entirely on Reeves. And when the explanation ended, there was a pause, not long, but long enough to make it clear that the answer had been heard and weighed. "And what verification did you conduct before detaining him?" the agent asked, his voice still even, still steady, but sharper now, cutting directly to the part of the situation that mattered most. Reeves hesitated, just briefly, but it was enough for the silence to fill in the gap, enough for the question to answer itself without him needing to say anything more. Marcus turned slightly then, not stepping forward, not inserting himself into the exchange, but simply allowing his presence to be felt in a different way now, no longer as the center of the conflict, but as the quiet point around which everything else was being measured. "You saw what you expected to see," Marcus said calmly, his voice low, not directed at the agents, not even fully directed at Reeves, but at the truth of the moment itself, "and you acted on it." The words did not accuse, they clarified, and that made them harder to dismiss, harder to argue against, because they did not rely on emotion, they relied on reality. Reeves exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight of the situation had finally settled in fully, not as something he could push against, but as something he now had to face. The second officer took another small step back, his eyes moving between the agent and Reeves, his silence now fully aligned with the shift that had taken place. And there, on that same quiet porch, under the fading light of a day that had started like any other, the roles had reversed completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of truth, leaving Officer Daniel Reeves standing not as the one in control, but as the one being seen clearly for the first time. The air on the porch felt different now, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, as if something that had been hidden beneath layers of assumption had finally been pulled into the open, and no one standing there could pretend they did not see it anymore, especially Officer Daniel Reeves, who remained in place with his hands at his sides, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, like someone trying to stand steady on ground that had suddenly shifted beneath him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agent held his gaze for a moment longer, not with hostility, not with anger, but with a level of focus that made it impossible to look away, because this was no longer about control, it was about accountability, and that carried a weight far heavier than authority ever could. "We will be documenting everything that occurred here today," the agent said, his tone even, each word measured with precision, "including the initial report, your response, and the actions that followed." There was no threat in the statement, but there did not need to be, because the implication was already clear, the process already set in motion, and for the first time, Reeves could not interrupt it, could not redirect it, could not place himself above it. He swallowed once, his eyes shifting briefly toward the street where the quiet presence of onlookers still lingered, phones lowered now but attention fixed, Because what had started as curiosity had turned into something else entirely, something closer to realization. "I was doing my job," Reeves said finally, his voice lower than before, less certain, as if the words themselves did not hold the same weight they once did, and as soon as they left his mouth, they seemed to hang there, not convincing, not complete. Marcus Johnson turned slightly then, facing him more directly, his expression still calm, but there was something firmer behind it now, not anger, not satisfaction, just truth spoken without hesitation. "Your job is not to assume who belongs and who does not," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, carrying across the small space without force. "Your job is to protect without bias." The words settled into the moment, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be dismissed, because they did not challenge the system, they defined it, and in doing so, revealed exactly where it had failed. The second officer lowered his gaze slightly, his stance no longer aligned with Reeves at all, his silence now a quiet acknowledgement of what had become impossible to ignore. The agent gave a small nod, not toward Marcus, not toward Reeves, but toward the situation itself, as if marking the point where everything had shifted from confusion to consequence. "Officer Reeves," he continued, "you will need to remain available for follow-up regarding this incident." His tone unchanged, professional, controlled, but carrying the finality of something already decided. Reeves nodded once, almost automatically, his movements slower now, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more reflective, as if he was beginning to understand that this moment was not isolated. It was not something that would simply pass. It was something that would follow him beyond this porch, beyond this street, into places where his actions would be examined without the protection he once assumed he had. Marcus stepped back slightly then, not to create distance, but to reclaim space, his porch once again becoming what it was always meant to be, his presence there no longer questioned, no longer challenged, just recognized for what it was. The sun had dipped lower now, the light softer, stretching long shadows across the wood, and in that quiet, grounded moment, the reality of what had happened settled fully into place, not with noise, not with conflict, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with force, sometimes it arrives with truth, and once it does, nothing remains the same. The last of the daylight faded slowly across the porch, stretching shadows into long, quiet lines that seemed to settle everything into place. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because the moment itself demanded stillness, demanded recognition of what had just happened and what it meant beyond the surface of a single encounter. Marcus Johnson stood near the edge of the porch, his hands now free at his sides, his posture relaxed but grounded, the same presence he had carried from the beginning now fully understood for what it was, not something hidden, not something uncertain, but something that had been there all along, waiting for the truth to catch up. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agents began to step back toward their vehicle, not hurried, not dramatic. Their job in this moment complete not because they had intervened with force, but because they had allowed reality to reveal itself exactly as it needed to. And as they moved, the quiet authority they carried did not fade. It lingered, leaving behind a space where clarity had replaced confusion. Officer Daniel Reeves remained where he was for a second longer, his gaze shifting once more toward Marcus. But this time there was no challenge in it, no assumption, only the weight of understanding settling in, the kind that does not come from being told, but from being shown in a way that cannot be ignored. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not as a gesture of agreement, but as an acknowledgement that something had changed, something inside the way he would see moments like this moving forward, whether he was ready to admit it or not. The second officer turned back toward the patrol car, his movements quieter now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a kind of silent acceptance, as if he had witnessed something he would not forget, something that would stay with him long after this street returned to its usual calm. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath that carried no relief, no release, just a quiet return to himself, and he reached for the coffee mug he had set down earlier. The surface now cooled, the moment that had interrupted it now passed, though not erased. He looked out across the street, not at anyone in particular, but at the space itself, the houses, the sidewalks, the windows where people had watched without speaking, and there was no resentment in his expression, no visible anger, just a steady awareness that moments like this were not isolated, they were part of something larger, something that did not always announce itself, but existed nonetheless. The SUV doors closed one by one, soft, controlled, and the engine started again with a quiet hum. The vehicle pulling away from the curb without urgency, leaving behind a street that felt the same on the surface, yet different in a way that could not be seen. Only understood. Reeves finally turned as well, walking back toward his patrol car with slower steps than before, his posture no longer defined by command, but by reflection, and as he opened the door, he paused for just a second, his hand resting against the frame, his eyes fixed ahead, as if replaying the moment in his mind, not to justify it, but to understand it. And standing there on that porch,